Hi folks, it's Marc from Pre-Site Safety. Firstly, I hope you're all well and safe during this incredibly strange and quite frankly weird lockdown period where we're all stuck at home. I know having been quiet on our Pre-Site Safety channels for some time, it's certainly been a challenging adjustment for myself and my family. And a personally proud moment, my wife's actually working on the NHS frontline, so as well as making us proud, it's actually been a very, very helpful perspective setting exercise to show just how fortunate we are versus some of the other unfortunate souls dealing with the current pandemic crisis. What I wanted to share with you today was the audio and podcast version of a recent interview I was fortunate enough to be invited to conduct with Energy Voice, and in particular with Energy Voice's Allister Thomas. Now, that came after recent publication of our peer-reviewed piece on the long-term moral implications of accidents. That piece was set around the central story of the Piper Alpha disaster, from which my father survived but struggled for many, many years afterwards. But what we've done now is to take the concept central to that article, which was the effect of dominoes falling, and the fact that what we often see in an accident is looking at a domino face on. We see the immediate details of an accident, but what's harder to do is to tilt our view and to look at all the dominoes that fall after the first one. So in the context of safety and accidents, what happens over the longer term after the initial accident itself? What happens when the cameras stop rolling and the newspapers have gone away? So that's what the article is about. We'll certainly link that for you in the description below and on our various social posts. But what you're about to hear, without further ado, is Allister's questions to me on the article and more broadly on the topic of looking at accidents over the longer term. So I hope you enjoy it, and once again I hope you're safe and I hope you're well with your families at home. All the very best. Thank you.
I suppose just a good way to start. I think your aims are obviously set out in the document, but just by way of setting the scene for me, can you sort of set out in your own words why you decided to publish this report?
Of course. So I think before anyone knows anything about me on the surface, it seems like a rather strange thing to do. My professional life isn't in oil and gas, at least not directly. As a scientist, I'm working in chemistry and, figuring out new ways to make chemistry work on a large scale. So in that respect, I've dealt a lot in my professional life with safety concerns of chemistry on the small scale in a university, but also working with colleagues in industry and dealing with chemistry on its largest scales and all the additional safety concerns that brings. And when you dig into that a little bit more, one thing that really was an itch that I needed to scratch when I started my academic life was hearing more and more in the chemistry literature about accidents that had happened, people that had lost their lives or people that had had life-changing injuries. And that was consistent whether you were in those small-scale university labs or the large-scale process chemistry environments. And so I kept thinking, was there ways that we could tackle this differently? Was there a way to make safety not just a need-to-do task, but something that we absolutely want to do and want to tap into, not just as the thing we need to do before research, but can we make safety the research itself? And so I really wanted to dig into that, but it wasn't until 2018 when the 30th anniversary of the Piper Alpha rolled round that I really started to think about things from the more personal perspective. And for the first time, as strange as it sounds, realised that, I had a really deep personal stake in this, something that had been boiling away in my mind from what I had learned about growing up, that I now all of a sudden realised I had the opportunity to really action more strongly in my professional life. So it was marrying what I had seen happening in chemistry with what I'd learned about growing up from my father and what I'd learned about from oil and gas, and specifically the Piper Alpha accident. So in a nutshell, all of this has been trying to give a broader audience the lessons that I was given growing up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely does, yeah. I noticed at the start of your report, you do mention, and just sort of leading on from what you say there, you do mention that this Piper Alpha is obviously well known among the likes of chemical engineers, but your particular field,
Yes.
chemistry, chemists, not so much. And as you say, not necessarily something that's blindingly obvious to the sort of, I guess, the lab desk chemist. But can you talk to that point? It's not well known, but it's important that the sort of transferable lessons, I suppose, are taken on across different industries.
Absolutely. So the reason I think cases like Piper Alpha are so well known to chemical engineers is because Piper Alpha was on the scale that chemical engineers live, breathe and work in. It's the largest scale operations with a lot of dangerous chemicals. That's what chemical engineers learn about first and foremost. And so quite naturally from that, chemical engineers have always had a really good grounding in safety practices and how to properly manage and design safety into processes. It's the absolute bread and butter of a chemical engineer. Now, I say that with a pinch of salt because I'm not one, but I have studied and worked with people in that area, and it's entirely consistent with how I see them working. And all the textbooks that you see on chemical engineering have cases like Piper Alpha as a case study to learn from. The health and safety executive still have courses where Piper Alpha is a key case study to learn from. Process safety management qualification that I took had Piper Alpha as a study to learn from. But in chemistry, where I'm working, when we're working at the research level, you tend to work on a much, much smaller scale to begin with. You're trying to invent reactions that the world hasn't seen before, and you never ever start off doing that on a massive scale like a chemical engineer would consider. If I can put it into other terms, chemists such as myself might do reactions in a teacup. The job of a chemical engineer, on the other hand, is to figure out how to get that reaction in a teacup to work inside a swimming pool. And on those two different environments, those two different theatres, if you like, the things that you're talking about, the stories that you're telling, especially with regards to safety, come from very different perspectives. And so even though chemistry and chemical engineering are very fundamentally intertwined, the conversations and indeed the training that someone has in safety is very, very different on the two sides of that same coin.
Indeed, and just to follow up on that, you do mention there is a couple of specific incidents where you've sort of found maybe, perhaps on the face of it there aren't huge parallels, but there was, I think, one incident specifically in Hawaii you referenced, which would be of perhaps bridging the gap between the two and having some common ground.
Yeah, so that so there's a couple examples within chemistry. I mentioned earlier that I had come across various reports of things happening in the chemistry space, accidents in laboratories that are utterly avoidable, the same way that many of the large-scale accidents like Piper Alpha are avoidable, and there's lessons to learn from them. The parallel that I've tried to draw is in the concept that I've tried to put across in that article, which is, and we'll get to the details of the Hawaii accident in a second, but regardless of the accident, what we have a tendency to do is learn from the immediate details of it, to learn what we can read in newspaper articles or incident reports. And I've likened that as if we're looking at a domino straight in the face. we're standing toe to toe with a domino and looking at very, very clear details of what we can see on that surface. But what you cannot possibly learn from those immediate reports and the bird's eye view of such an accident is what happens over a much, much longer stretch of time. So if you continue that domino analogy, what happens if you don't look at it on the most obvious direct view, but turn sideways and look down the line to see what that first domino is hiding? How many other dominoes are lined up behind it? And when you look at things that way, you realise that if an accident, the first domino, the thing that you see most clearly, if that's simply the first domino to fall, as soon as you take that longer term view and look further down the line, you realise that that's not the only domino to fall. All the dominoes behind it have to fall as well. And then the question becomes, well, what are those other dominoes? If number one is the accident, then, as I've said in the article, the things that go on behind that, the other dominoes might be physical injury or family bereavement, broken relationships, survivor's guilt, all of that sort of stuff. And that's what I learned directly from my father in Piper Alpha. But now if you take that to your point about the Hawaii accident, that's a very recent, very severe and tragic case within the chemistry space, not the chemical engineering or the oil and gas space, where you can use that same principle. So on the surface, when you look at that accident face on, that first domino, what you learn about is that a postdoctoral researcher, Dr. Thea Ekins-Coward, was working in a laboratory in Hawaii. She was working with some equipment that wasn't fit for purpose. She required and requested some specific safety training which wasn't forthcoming, wasn't appropriate for the task, and ultimately the equipment that she was using exploded mid-use and she lost part of her right arm. And that was essentially the end of her research career, right in the prime of it. And that's what you learn about on the surface. That's that first domino. But if you look deeper into that, at the lawsuits that are going on now and some of the longer term news reports that you read, the longer term view, looking beyond that first domino for Dr. Ekins-Coward, is she's got this debilitating physical injury, but now she's got a prolonged legal battle to deal with. She's lost part of her independence because she's lost part of one of her main limbs. She's got financial challenges because she can no longer pursue the career that she was at the heart of before. She's thinking about how she's going to sustain herself, both physically and mentally going forward. These are things that you do not see when you read about these accidents for the first time. And you can only really appreciate them if you take that longer term view and see what happens after the accident and see what happens after that very first domino falls over. And I get the last point to that is, let's take the very frank view, as I've done when I've been speaking about this to audiences. You might not care about example one, which is me, my father, and the Piper Alpha. You might not care about example two, which is Dr. Ekins-Coward and the Hawaii accident and the explosion. But the point that remains, the tool that is there for other people to apply, is what happens if you put the accidents that you know about or you care about onto this domino analogy.
Yeah. And just getting onto that then, you speak clearly quite very candidly, rightly so, about the impact this had on your father. The domino analogy clearly is reflected in the long-term impact this Piper Alpha specifically had on him and his life as a survivor.
Yeah.
Could you speak about that, and could you speak about what benefit do you see in speaking candidly about that in terms of driving these lessons home in your reports?
Sure. And I think up front, if we circle back all the way to the first interview I did with Energy Voice, none of this is ever easy to speak about, and it can't be. But what it can be, and what I've realised over the past few years, is it's a light bulb moment for many people who haven't been able to see it as personally and as forthrightly as I have, just through my life circumstance. I've had a number of really great opportunities to speak to various audiences about this story, and the feedback that we get from that is that people walk away realising that accidents are much, much more than a single point in time, and the ripple effect, this domino effect of those accidents can go on for a very, very long time indeed. And the thing that made this quite crystalline and obvious when I started digging into it is around the time of the 30th anniversary of Piper Alpha. It was around the time of my 30th birthday, and because I was only a few months old when it happened, so it really has been from beginning to end a 30-year journey to realise all the lessons that could come from this one very well-known accident. And so I felt at that point, although it was a difficult story to tell, it was one that ultimately I had both the opportunity and the privilege to be able to tell, because I could see very clearly that it wasn't as obvious to everyone else, nor should it be as obvious to everyone else as it was to me. As you know, as I said more deeply in the article and in my first interview with Energy Voice, my father was one of several people who survived Piper Alpha who struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So for him, it was always reliving his ordeal of how he managed to escape the blazing inferno of Piper Alpha, how he managed to negotiate his way off the platform and past many of his colleagues who weren't fortunate enough to survive, and always reliving that when he got home. And for us, that was manifest, as I've written about and spoken about, in his alcoholism, and it was on and off alcohol all the time. But it was always, when he was speaking about that, it was always reliving part of that experience. He would always mention Piper Alpha 10 years later, 20 years later, and you could see it was crying for help, but how to help him was the major challenge. And I say that, the last point I'd like to make is it's always very easy for me to lead this with the personal side, but you know, my father was one of about a fifth of the survivors who struggled with post-traumatic stress. He was by no means the only one. And if you go beyond safety accidents but look at global statistics more broadly, it's something like, 4% of the entire world's population have suffered from this illness through some traumatic event that they've experienced that has stuck with them in a very, very challenging way for a long time after the fact.
Mm-hmm. Just obviously your reasons for this are it's clearly highly personal. It's obviously academic as well. In terms of your dad, though, is it fair to say it's maybe some way of honouring your father? This story that you've passed on and have published now.
Absolutely. That's why I've used the word privilege a number of times, because I realise that as difficult as that story has been to tell, I always realise that I'm telling it from the point of view of someone who did have a father come home to them, and I have many, many happy memories with my father and family where it could have been the complete opposite. I could be sitting here wondering what it might have been like to grow up with a father had he never come home on the night of the disaster itself. So I realised that there was as there is throughout everyone's life, at every time there are many, many forks in the road. And although the road that we've walked down hasn't been by any means an easy one, it could have been still a far less fortunate one than that. So I certainly count it as a privilege to be able to use that difficult experience, remember my father in a very, very productive way, and whether it's writing about it or speaking about it, another word that I've used beyond privilege is therapeutic. I'm using a very, very difficult experience in the most positive and productive way I possibly can. And although it's now, you mentioned the word academic as well, absolutely. This article went through peer review and a number of revisions, and it'll be something that people can cite. That's what academics like to do. But ultimately, that's come a number of years after all of this work started. It never started as an academic enterprise. It's a duty that I felt to bring it to an academic audience who can ultimately use this. But I want to take this message way beyond the article and way beyond the confines of the university. This is a message and a concept that safety professionals should be able to use, whether you're in chemistry, chemical engineering, academia, industry, wherever you are. This is a concept that I'm really passionate about, and I think that other people can use.
And just lastly, you mentioned, you cite in the report, you talk about how certain previous lessons, for instance, before and since, weren't necessarily used. One of those you reference is the Alexander Kielland disaster in Norway. Now, we have the 40-year anniversary of that coming up. So I was interested if you could speak to that point. You know, the fact that I think 8 years prior to Piper Alpha, there was this incident in Norway. The lessons from that weren't necessarily heeded. You know, could you speak about the fact that obviously that should have been heeded? And do you think, I mean, it's one instance, I don't know, but would you say that the outcome might have been different had that been the case?
Ultimately, yes, it could have been different. I believe it was, so the main number coming out of Piper Alpha was that from the Cullen inquiry there were no fewer than 106 recommended actions to improve the safety practices in the oil and gas sector following what was learned from Piper Alpha. Now, of those 106 recommendations, the full 106 have now been actioned. So it's an emphatic call to action and a message being heeded by the community. So that's absolutely pristine in terms of doing what is called for. But in the Alexander Kielland case, it was something like 105 out of the 106 recommendations for Piper Alpha had already come from that previous accident. So 105 out of the 106 calls to improvement for safety on oil rigs and offshore platforms could, in theory, have been in some way actioned in those 8 years prior to the accident that led to the demise of Piper Alpha. Now, in balance, hindsight's always 20/20. There's always a woulda, coulda, shoulda. And although I can't name this person yet, I've just started a conversation with someone who reached out after reading the same article to say that they were around working as an engineer at the time of that earlier accident and worked on some of the recommendations that were made, but now they in some way feel a little bit of guilt, and I'm not saying that they should be guilty. I don't think they should, but it's a normal human reaction that they're feeling a little bit guilty, thinking, coulda, shoulda, done more? Could I have made those recommendations louder? Could I have made more people learn about it? Could I have made the right people learn about it before Piper Alpha? And I think as a bottom line, that's the lesson that always sticks with the safety community. The reason that we learn about all of these stories of accidents is because more often than not, it takes an accident to happen before people truly learn from it and improve the way that they're working. Being proactive, seeing accidents before they happen, is a very, very deep human challenge for us, and I don't think it's one that will ever go away, but it's one that we're definitely getting better at as time goes on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fantastic. Marc, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you taking time to speak to us. But no, for the time being, I think we'll have something later this week on the report itself. So thanks very much for that, Marc. Appreciate it.
That's been a pleasure.
Great. I'll do that. That's grand. Thanks very much, man. I appreciate that.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Cheers, you too. Thank you.
All the best.